Have you been fighting to get off that auto mode into maybe one of the priority modes? But are you finding that every time you do, the images are either too bright or they're too dark or they're not even in focus? But then you go back to auto and the camera's working fine. These priority modes, they're supposed to help you. They're supposed to keep the images properly exposed. I run a regular beginner's photography workshop, and at the start of the workshops, I do a health check on everybody's cameras. I find at least half of the cameras have 1 or 2 or even 3 settings that fundamentally affect how the camera works and changes the photos for the worse. So there's going to be 3 settings I'm going to show you today, which can be really common problems when in these priority modes, and how you can understand what your camera is doing, what the problem is, and of course I'm going to show you how to fix it. Very briefly, priority modes in your camera is where you can take control of either the aperture to control the depth of field or the shutter speed to control how movement is portrayed. And then the camera is still going to look after all the other settings for you, so your exposure is not too bright, not too dark, just right. I'm here in the National Gallery of Australia in the Sculpture Garden, and this first shot, I'm leaving my camera on auto mode. Let's check it out. Let's see what we get. Nice little composition, boom, and look, perfectly exposed, normal photo, auto mode, save the day. But if I go and now change my camera into aperture priority, so aperture priority, I control the aperture, but the camera is still supposed to control everything else to make the exposure not too bright, not too dark, just right. But if I try to take this shot now, have a look at that, incredibly underexposed. Now, if you don't know what your camera's doing, you don't know why it's underexposing. And this particular problem can also present in another way where it's overexposing. Oh, so that's absolutely terrible and is not going to work. So what's the first problem that we're fixing? It's something called exposure compensation. Exposure compensation in your camera, when you're in a priority mode, allows you to deliberately overexpose or underexpose an image as opposed to the camera's idea of what is a normal exposure. You would do this either to overcome problems, maybe your subject isn't properly exposed, or you're doing it for aesthetic and creative reasons. You want a bright and airy feel, or you want a dark and gloomy feel. But the thing is, if your exposure compensation has changed and you don't realize it, now all of a sudden you're not getting the exposure that you're expecting. So how do we sort this one out? On the back of the Canon here, we can see this bar. This is our exposure meter bar. And ideally, we want that dot in the middle. That's telling the camera not too bright, not too dark, just right. But in those shots that you saw before, they were too dark, they were too bright. So if the dot is to the left into the minuses, this is when you're going to get an underexposed image. And when it's over here to the right is when you're going to get an overexposed image. Now, if you're not familiar enough with your camera and keeping an eye out for this setting, it's one that's easy to miss, and it won't reset itself when you turn the camera off either. If your exposure compensation has changed and you turn your camera off, turn it back on, there it is waiting for you right where you left it. So we always want to have our exposure compensation into the middle. Now, most cameras will have that bar, but some cameras, it might just be a 0.0, which will then go into minus and plus. Down in the corner, keep an eye out for it. And if you're a Nikon shooter, the absence of that exposure meter bar means that it is in the middle, not too bright, not too dark. It's only when you adjust exposure compensation up or down that in Nikons, that's when the bar appears. A lot of cameras will have a dedicated speed button for exposure compensation. It looks like this. You just press and hold it and then adjust your dial to make it go up and down. In my Canon here, it's the scroll wheel, as you can see. And in some cameras, you've actually got a dedicated exposure compensation dial on the top, like you see on Fuji's, for example. I love the retro look of those cameras. I'm really hoping Canon comes up with one soon. If you're having trouble finding out how to adjust the setting in your camera, just look up exposure compensation in your manual. So now that I've got my exposure compensation set correctly, I've got the little dot sitting in the middle, let's check out this photo. Okay. There we go. That's much better. Everything's properly exposing now. We're not under, we're not over, we're just right. Let's move on to the next issue. So another issue that can present itself when you try to come off auto mode and into one of the priority modes is suddenly you're not focusing properly. So let's just check this one out. This is my subject right here. I'm in auto mode. Can I take an in focus shot? That's nice and sharp. That's in focus. So now let's go to aperture priority and get that same shot. Let's see if we're in focus. And we're not. The risk here is that when I look at the preview on the back of my camera, it looks like it's in focus, but then as soon as I zoom in, checking out the detail, my subject is obviously out of focus. So what's the problem that we're having here? The issue here is the focus mode. My camera is actually set to spot focus. So what this looks like when we go into there, it's a small, tiny little square. And you can see the size of it here. Now, we can move it around the screen, of course, like this. And it is a handy focus mode if you're trying to thread the needle. Let's pretend that you're trying to do a portrait of somebody, but you're looking through some trees and the branches. So this spot focus will allow you to get focus directly on the person's face and not have the camera get excited by the tree branches and focusing on them instead. The problem with this is if you don't realise that your camera is on spot focus and maybe it's up in the corner, you're trying to focus into the sky all the time instead of the middle of frame. So my recommendation is to use something like whole area AF. This means the camera is going to look at the entire scene and it's going to make the decision what it thinks you want to be focusing on. Now, it's not always perfect, and this is why we can then go to the other focus modes if it is getting excited by the wrong subject. But for me, it's a good idea just to start out in that whole area autofocus. And another little tip here, make sure your lens is actually set to autofocus and not manual focus. If you're in manual focus, it's exactly what it says on the tin. You're the one responsible for focus. So make sure AF is what is selected on your lens. Now, when we go back to Glenn, he's actually just going to move the spot back over the gorilla's paw, and let's see what happens this time. Let's try that again. There we go, obviously in focus, lovely and sharp. We've got some nice defocus into the background, which was my goal. So knowing where your camera is focusing is another one of those things that can catch out beginners who are trying to get off auto mode and be more creative. Let's check out another issue. So what's another issue when you get off auto mode into these priority modes? So let's check out this sculpture here. I'm going to shoot it in auto. There we go. And that looks fine. We're normally exposed. I'm going to go into a priority mode now. And what shot do we get this time? That's shocking. Now, it might feel like one of our other problems with exposure compensation, where it's too bright, but actually when we have a look at the back of the camera, the exposure compensation bar, our dot is in the middle. So what's the issue? It's actually our ISO. For this shot, my camera's ISO was set to 6400. Now, this is not normally something that you would use during the day, but I see it a lot where people have either maybe tried some astrophotography or they've changed their ISO and just don't really understand what it's doing. Now, when we're at 6400 ISO, this is really high. The camera's trying to make the image really bright. And if we're outside during the day, as I pointed into a bit of white light here, you can see my shutter has gone to 1/8,000th of a second, so it's blindingly fast, but it's flashing. It's flashing because the camera has gone as fast as it can go, but it's still not going to give us a proper exposure. That's why the image was so bright. For beginners, I actually recommend Auto ISO. Auto ISO in today's cameras, it's pretty smart. The camera knows not to raise the ISO unless it's really necessary. So by setting it to auto, it's just something that you don't have to worry about and be conscious of. Although you can graduate to manually controlling your ISO down the track when you get more comfortable with your camera. Most cameras will let you scroll to auto ISO like you just saw on my Canon, but if you're a Nikon shooter, you'll need to go into your menu and turn on auto ISO sensitivity. And now when I do that same little experiment again, there we go. ISO 100, much more reasonable shutter speed, 1/320th of a second. This is a shot that would be correctly exposed. We're gonna go back and see the result, but hang around, I've got one last bonus tip for you. Let's take that same photo, no other settings have changed, but let's check this one out. There we go, that's much better. Now, of course, there's more than these three things that can cause your camera to play up and not give you the results that you're expecting, but they are the most common ones that I do see when I run my workshops. But if you are still having problems, there's one last little joker up your sleeve, and that's a camera reset. This is especially handy if you've got a second-hand camera, because who knows how the dials were customized by the previous owner. It's also handy if you've accidentally changed something without realizing it and you don't know what it was. So we can go and do a camera reset. In the Canons, we go into menu system and our little wrench icon, and we come along to reset camera. It's basic settings and everything else. I like to just wipe everything out and start over if there's problems which are really weird. Check your camera's manual for how to reset it if that's what it takes. Congratulations. You're now taking more control of your camera and it's actually working as expected. So your exposures are right, your focusing is right, you can get out of auto mode, be more creative and take more control over your photos.